The 4-year-old child woke up every night from his dreams and cried constantly, "The water is coming. Move the crystals to a higher place." When his family rushed to his room, they found him sitting up in bed. Tears were streaming down his face. He was saying sentences that a 4-year-old child could not possibly construct. But what really frightened his family were the words he spoke during the day. While looking out the window of their home in Tucson, Arizona, at the desert landscape, he would talk about towers rising into the sky. He spoke of huge towers made of crystal and light, those massive towers rising with the energy of the earth. He would talk about a council of 12 who ignored the prophets. He would talk about a night when the earth shook and the ocean rose like a wall. One afternoon, he walked over to his father's desk. He opened Google Maps on the computer. He zoomed in on a point near the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. "This is where I lived. We all died here." What his family discovered at these coordinates was history, memory, and the lost city that had troubled humanity for thousands of years. It would force him to question everything he thought he knew. The Castellanos family led an ordinary life. Their days followed a predictable rhythm. Breakfast at 7, preschool cartoons, dinner together when Michael came home from work, stories before bed. Laughter. There was nothing in their lives to suggest they would become the center of one of modern parapsychology's most disturbing cases. Jacob had always been a quiet child. He wasn't shy. But compared to other children, he was constantly thinking about things. He would stare at the sky for hours, tracing invisible patterns with his finger. Rebecca had once mentioned this to the pediatrician during a routine checkup, but the doctor said it was normal. Some children could be more introverted than others. The nightmares began 2 weeks after Jacob's 4th birthday, in August 2019. The first time it happened, his mother Rebecca thought Jacob was sick. She heard him crying. She found him tangled in his sheets, sweaty and saying meaningless words. She held him until he calmed down. She gave him water. She put him back to sleep. But the next night, the same thing happened again, and the night after that too. By the end of the first week, the whole family was exhausted. It was his father, Michael, who first heard the words clearly. He was sitting by Jacob's bed at 2 in the morning. As he rubbed his son's back, Jacob suddenly sat up. He started screaming, "The water is coming. Move the crystals to a higher place." His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at something terrifying in the distance. Michael tried to wake him up completely. Jacob kept repeating the same sentence. His voice rose in panic. Then suddenly, he fell silent. He lay back down on his bed. He slept peacefully for the rest of the night. Rebecca wanted to take him to a sleep specialist. Michael thought it might be night terrors, something Jacob would outgrow. But then he started talking about it during the day. That is when everything changed. It was a Saturday morning in early September. Jacob was playing with his toy cars on the floor. Suddenly, he looked up at her and said, "Mom, do you remember the towers?" Rebecca smiled, thinking he was referring to a book. "Which towers?" Jacob looked at her questioningly, as if the answer were obvious. "The crystal towers. The towers that produce light. We built them near the water. That way, they could draw energy from deep places." Rebecca was surprised by her son's words. "Jacob, where did you hear that?" He didn't answer. He just went back to his cars. He began to push them slowly in circles. Rebecca knelt down beside him. "Jacob, look at me. What towers are you talking about?" Jacob looked into his mother's eyes for a moment. Rebecca saw something very different and frightening in his eyes. There was sadness and heaviness in them. "I am talking about the towers in the city, before they sank beneath the ocean." Over the next 2 weeks, Jacob began to provide details that his peers couldn't express. He spoke of a council of 12 leaders who refused to listen to the seers. He spoke of an energy grid connecting the towers and drawing power from the depths of the earth. He used words like harmonic frequency and magnetic alignment. He spoke of the earth shaking, cracks forming in the streets, and the elderly finally trying to evacuate. But he said he couldn't do it. He cried as he spoke of the wall of water that came at night and swallowed everything. Rebecca recorded him on her phone. She showed the videos to Michael, who stood in the kitchen, pale and silent. Michael listened to his 4-year-old son describe an advanced civilization using an engineer's vocabulary. "Maybe he saw something on YouTube," Michael said, but Jacob didn't have access to YouTube. He only watched carefully selected cartoons. Then came the moment that changed everything. On Sunday afternoon, Michael was on the computer, researching basic repair lessons for a project at work. Jacob entered the office. He climbed onto his father's lap. Without saying a word, he moved the mouse. He opened a new tab. He didn't type anything. He zoomed out on Google Maps. He dragged the screen over the Atlantic Ocean. He stopped at a specific point. He placed his little finger on the screen. "This is where I live. We all died here," he said. Michael looked at the coordinates. 28.7419 north, 24.2464 west. He was talking about the exact center of the Atlantic. There was nothing there. He looked at his son with astonished eyes. He searched for a hint of a joke, but Jacob climbed down from his lap. He returned to his toys. He acted as if he had simply pointed out the location of the grocery store. He, Michael, and Rebecca sat in the dark. They entered those coordinates into Google Earth. What they saw on the ocean floor made their hearts race. Rebecca held her husband's hand tightly. Rebecca's hands trembled as she zoomed in on the satellite images. There, on the ocean floor, about 2 miles below the surface of the Atlantic, were patterns. They were not random formations. They were not coral reefs or volcanic rocks. They were geometric shapes. There were straight lines intersecting at perfect right angles. There were circular structures arranged in concentric rings. And at the center, there was something that looked disturbingly like a grid. Michael looked closer at the screen. This must be a mistake, right? Some kind of mapping error? But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The resolution was too clear. The patterns were too deliberate. Rebecca opened images from different dates, from different satellites. The shapes were always there. They always appeared in the same configuration. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had emailed 3 universities, a marine archaeology department, and a foundation that studied unexplained phenomena in children. Most ignored him. One sent a polite but dismissive reply suggesting he consult a child psychologist. However, Dr. Raymond Osborne, a professor of cognitive development at the University of Arizona, agreed to meet with them. Dr. Osborne had spent 30 years studying memory formation in children. He had published 4 books and over 60 articles. He did not believe in reincarnation. He did not believe in past lives. He believed in science, data, and the measurable functions of the developing brain. When Rebecca showed him Jacob's videos, he watched them with the impartial interest of a man who had seen dozens of similar cases. "Children can be influenced by certain things," he replied. "They absorb information from everywhere. They constantly absorb information from the conversations they hear, the images they see on screen, the stories their relatives tell them. The human brain, especially during childhood, is like a pattern-seeking machine. Most of the time, it creates detailed narratives from fragments of unrelated inputs." "Miss Castellano, your son has an active imagination. That is a good thing, but what you are describing isn't proof of a past life. It is proof of a creative, intelligent child processing the world in his own way." Rebecca felt her face flush. "He gave us coordinates. The exact coordinates of a place he'd never been to, never even heard of. And when we looked, there were structures on the ocean floor." Dr. Osborne smiled patiently. "The human brain is also extraordinary at pattern recognition. We see faces in clouds. We see shapes in static electricity. Interpreting satellite images of the ocean floor is very difficult. What you saw could be sonar debris, tectonic ridges, sediment patterns, any natural formation." "Then meet him," said Michael. "Come talk to Jacob yourself. Test him. Ask him questions. If you are so sure this is just imagination, prove it." Dr. Osborne agreed. 3 days later, he arrived at their home with a bag full of materials. There were photographs of ancient ruins from around the world, deliberately mislabeled maps, images of random underwater formations. He was going to test Jacob. He sat down across from Jacob at the kitchen table. With the calm, clinical demeanor of a man conducting a routine experiment, he began the test. He showed Jacob a photograph of the Parthenon. "Do you recognize this place?" Jacob shook his head. He showed him the pyramids of Giza. "What about this?" "I don't know this one." Dr. Osborne took a note. Then he showed Jacob a sonar image of an underwater rock formation off the coast of Japan. "What about this?" Does it look familiar? Jacob studied the image carefully, then looked at the professor with those unsettling ancient eyes. Number these are just rocks. Dr. Osborne smiled. The boy wasn't simply saying yes to every image. He was distinguishing. That was to be expected. He showed another image. This time it was a digitally altered satellite photo of the mid-Atlantic ridge, deliberately manipulated to contain ambiguous geometric shapes. What about this one? Do you know this? Jacob leaned forward. He traced the shapes on the screen with his little finger. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he looked at Dr. Osborne. You've altered this. It is not what it appears to be, he said. The professor's smile faded. What do you mean? Jacob pointed to the center of the image. The big circle here is drawn wrong. There should be 3 circles, one inside the other, and the lines aren't going that way. They're going outwards from the center, like the spokes of a wheel. Dr. Osborne felt a strange tingling in his spine. He was surprised. He had deliberately altered the image to test the confabulation, to see if the child would simply agree with everything he was shown. But Jacob hadn't just rejected the image, he had corrected it, and his correction matched the unaltered, real satellite data Dr. Osborne had examined before the meeting. Jacob, can you tell me what these circles are for? The child looked at his hands. They were resonance fields. The towers stood inside the circles. They had to be placed at exactly the right intervals. Otherwise, the energy wouldn't flow. My teacher told me that. Her name was Lasara. He said the name as easily as if he were saying his kindergarten teacher's name. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Michael put his arm around her shoulder. Dr. Osborne sat motionless. His pen didn't move. Finally, he spoke. Jacob, how old were you when you lived in this place? Jacob thought. I don't know. I was an adult. I had a job. I worked on the energy grid. I kept the connection strong. Dr. Osborne closed his bag. He looked at Michael and Rebecca. For the first time since he had arrived, he didn't look like a confident academic. He looked nervous. I want to do some additional tests. I want to bring in a colleague who is an expert in cartography and geological formations. I want to compare Jacob's explanations with real satellite data in a controlled environment. His family agreed. Over the next 4 weeks, Jacob was tested by 3 different experts. He was recorded and questioned. He was shown hundreds of images. Jacob rejected most of them. However, when shown unaltered satellite images of the coordinates he had identified, he responded immediately and definitively. He pointed out where the towers were located. He described the layout of the central plaza. He mentioned the channels bringing seawater into the city for cooling and purification. And every detail he provided matched the geometric patterns visible in the sonar data. Dr. Osborne couldn't explain it anymore. Neither could his colleagues. In early November, he met with the Castellanos in their living room. He said words he never thought he would say. I don't know what your son accessed, but it is not random. It is not made up. It is consistent, detailed, and consistent with data he couldn't have encountered. Rebecca looked at her husband. Then we have to go there, Michael said. Where should we go? Rebecca turned to Dr. Osborne. Is there a way to investigate it? Is it possible to send a team there? The professor shook his head. It is nearly 2 miles deep. That would require a submarine, a research vessel, and significant funding. It is not something a family could easily arrange. But Rebecca wasn't listening to the reasons why it couldn't be done. She was thinking of ways it could be done. Within a week, she contacted a private marine research organization, specializing in deep-sea archaeology. She told them about Jacob. She sent them the videos, test results, and satellite images. Most ignored her. One responded. His name was Captain Dale Whitmore. He was a retired naval sonar technician. He now organized privately funded expeditions to investigate underwater anomalies. He had heard stranger stories. He had seen stranger things. And he had access to a deep-sea diving vessel. In December 2019, he agreed to meet the family in Miami. If the child could provide the correct navigation details without access to maps or computers, Whitmore would take them to the area. The journey began on a cold morning in early January 2020. The Castellanos family flew to Miami with Jacob and Dr. Osborne, who insisted on coming as an observer. They boarded Whitmore's research vessel. This ship was equipped with sonar, submarine deployment cranes, and a crew of 6. It was a refurbished offshore platform support vessel. As the boat headed out into the open Atlantic, Jacob stood at the railing, gazing at the horizon. Jacob said nothing for hours. The water was turning from green to deep, endless blue. On the second day, when they were more than 300 miles out at sea, he spoke. He was sitting in the galley eating a sandwich. Suddenly, he stood up and went out on deck. Michael followed him. Jacob walked straight to the port side. He leaned on the railing. He pointed at the water. "Here, right below us." Captain Whitmore checked a GPS. They were half a mile from the coordinates Jacob had given him 2 months ago. Captain Whitmore said nothing for a long time. He just stood at the navigation console. He looked at the blinking dot on the screen showing their position. Then he looked at the little boy standing on the deck, pointing decisively at the water. He had been doing this job for 17 years. He had seen naval officers with decades of experience struggle to navigate the open sea without instruments. And now, a 4-year-old child was guiding them to a precise location in the middle of the Atlantic without even looking at a map. He gave the order to deploy the sonar array. The crew worked quickly to lower the towed device into the water. They let it sink to the depths. Within an hour, the first images began appearing on the screens in the operations room. Dr. Osborne stood behind the sonar technician, watching the lines and shadows transform into shapes. Michael and Rebecca held Jacob between them, their hands on his shoulders. No one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the equipment and the low rhythmic pulses of the sonar signals. Just then, something interesting happened. The technician's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Captain, you need to see this." Whitmore moved toward the screen. What he saw took his breath away. The sonar image showed a massive circular formation on the ocean floor, nearly 3 miles in diameter. Inside it were concentric rings of raised structures, evenly spaced, radiating outward from a central point. Between the rings were perfectly straight lines like the spokes of a wheel, and at the center was a cluster of shapes that were too symmetrical and precise to be natural. "Run it again. I want a second pass at higher resolution." The technician complied. He scanned again. The image came back sharper and clearer. The structures were still there. The geometry was still perfect. Whitmore turned to Dr. Osborne. "This is not a rock formation. This is not a volcanic ridge. This is an architectural structure." He looked at Rebecca Jacob. Jacob was staring at the screen with an expression he had never seen before. She wasn't excited. There was only deep, painful sorrow. "I told you it was there." Whitmore made his decision immediately. "We're going down." He ordered the submarine to be made ready for use. The 2-person vessel had a single observation window. It was a narrow titanium sphere with mechanical arms for collecting samples. Whitmore would pilot it. Dr. Osborne volunteered to go with him, despite his fear of enclosed spaces. "If this is real, I need to see it with my own eyes." The descent took nearly 2 hours. Sunlight disappeared within the first 30 meters. It was replaced by an overwhelming darkness. Whitmore used the instruments to guide the submarine down the sonar path. He followed the coordinates Jacob had given. At 500 meters, they turned on the external projectors. At 1,800 meters, the ocean floor came into view. Dr. Osborne pressed his face against the window. He felt his understanding of the world shatter. The structures rose from the mud like the bones of a drowned god. Huge stone pillars, each at least 30 feet in diameter, were arranged in a perfect circle. Between them lay sediment and coral accumulated over centuries. There were wall remnants, and at the center, partially buried, was a platform made of a material that shimmered even at 2 miles deep. Whitmore maneuvered the submarine closer. The mechanical arm extended. It scraped away the layer of mud on one of the columns. The stone beneath was smooth, polished. It was covered with marks that were not the result of natural erosion. There were symbols and writing in a language. "My God, this is real. This is really real," said Dr. Osborne. Whitmore steered the submarine toward the central platform. As they approached, the lights caught something protruding from the sediment near the base of one of the columns. It was a rectangular object, about the size of a suitcase partially covered in mud. Whitmore carefully positioned the mechanical arm. It grasped the object and lifted it out. A cloud of sediment rose around it. But when the cloud dispersed, both men could see what they had recovered. It was a container. Despite being underwater for thousands of years, it was made of an uncorroded, undamaged metallic material. Its surface was smooth. There were markings on its edge. The same symbols they had seen on the columns were here too. Whitmore placed the container in the sample basket. "We're going up," he said. The ascent was very difficult. Dr. Osborne couldn't take his eyes off the container hanging in the basket just outside the window. He had every possible explanation and logical framework he had developed during his 30 years of academic work in his mind, but none of them seemed sufficient. When they finally reached the surface, his legs were shaking. Rebecca and Michael ran to Jacob, taking him between them. The child stopped a meter away from the container. He stood still. His eyes were fixed on the symbols etched into the surface. "This is mine. I put it there." Whitmore knelt beside the container and began examining it with a hand scanner. "The material doesn't match any known alloy. Its density was far above normal. I don't know how to open it." Jacob stepped forward. "You are not opening it. You are unlocking it." He extended his small hand and placed it on the surface. His fingers traced the symbols in a specific order. 3 vertical lines, a circle, 2 diagonal lines, a curve. Inside, there was a single object protected by a mechanism no one could explain. There was a crystal. It was the size of a tennis ball, completely clear, with veins of light running through it like frozen lightning from its core. And next to it, pressed into a thin layer of the container's metallic material, was a star map. It wasn't a modern star map. It was not a representation of the constellations visible today. It was a map of the night sky as it had been positioned thousands of years ago. Specific points were marked and labeled with symbols covering the container. Dr. Osborne lifted the crystal. The crystal was warm. It was warm even after all that time spent underwater, all those centuries spent in darkness. He slowly turned the crystal, watching the light refract and bend off its faces. He realized it was a technology. It was not a jewel. It was not a natural formation. It was an engineered object. A tool, part of something far more sophisticated than anything that should have existed in the ancient world. Jacob reached out and touched the crystal. The light inside flickered once, as if reacting to his presence, with a soft glow. He looked at Dr. Osborne with those old, sorrowful eyes. "We used these to store energy. When the warnings came, this was going to be moved to the mountain facility. But I didn't finish in time. The water came too fast." Whitmore didn't know what to do at that moment. He just stayed silent. Rebecca was now crying openly. She covered her mouth with her hand. Michael just looked at his son. Dr. Osborne gently placed the crystal on the floor and looked at Jacob. "What happened to you?" "What happened when the water came? I drowned. I was trying to save the crystals from the main tower. The building collapsed. I couldn't get out." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I was so scared, but then I woke up here in 2020. With you." The professor, who had built his career on skepticism and experimental evidence, knelt down in front of the child. "I believe you." The container and its contents were transported back to Miami under the supervision of Captain Whitmore, who had been contacted during the return journey, and a team of marine archaeologists. The crystal was examined by materials scientists at 3 separate universities. None could identify its composition. Carbon dating of the sediment around the container showed it had been underwater for at least 11,000 years. This corresponded to a period when, according to conventional history, an advanced civilization should not have existed. Dr. Raymond Osborne published an article 6 months later, co-authored with 2 colleagues from the expedition. The article was titled "Anomalous Architectural Structures and Artifacts Recovered from the Mid-Atlantic Basin: Implications for Prehistoric Technology." The article was met with fierce resistance from academic circles. Critics labeled it pseudoscience. Journals refused to publish follow-up studies. Osborne's reputation suffered significantly. He had seen the structures with his own eyes. He had held the crystal in his hand, and he had watched a 4-year-old child open a box that had been sealed for thousands of years. The Castellano family returned to their quiet life in Tucson. But nothing was the same. Documentaries were made. Interviews were conducted. And then interest suddenly waned. The government intervened and removed the story from the press. The world moved on to the next mystery, the next unexplained phenomenon. But Jacob did not. The nightmares ended after the journey. For the first time in months, he slept peacefully. The urge to talk about the towers, the water, the city beneath the waves, all vanished like a dream when he woke up. By the time he was 5, he rarely spoke of it. When asked about the expedition, he would smile politely and say he didn't remember much. Rebecca sometimes wondered if that had been the purpose all along. It wasn't to prove the existence of the lost city of Atlantis to the world. It was simply to ensure that a soul trapped between two lives finally found peace. Jacob grew up normally after that. Dr. Osborne stayed in touch with the family over the years. He sent birthday cards. He called them during the holidays. When Jacob turned 10, Osborne visited them one last time. He brought a photograph taken during the dive. He handed the photo to Jacob and quietly asked if he remembered the meaning of the symbols. Jacob studied the photo for a long time. Then he looked at the professor and said he didn't remember. The crystal is stored in a secure facility in a secret location. Occasionally, it is examined by researchers. The star map has been analyzed by astronomers. It has been confirmed that the arrangement of celestial bodies shown on it matches the positions of stars visible approximately 12,000 years ago. The metal has still not been identified, and the structures on the ocean floor, at coordinates 28.7419 north, 24.2464 west, are still waiting there. What do you think about Jacob really carrying the memories of a civilization lost beneath the Atlantic? Do you think this is an extraordinary coincidence, an unexplained phenomenon with a rational explanation we haven't found yet? And if you want to join us on the next mystery, the next impossible story that challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and memory, subscribe now. Because there are plenty of kids like Jacob in the world. Children who remember things they shouldn't know. Children who point out places on a map they've never seen. And sometimes, when we follow them, we realize that the past isn't as dead as we thought. It is just sleeping, waiting to be remembered.